Good afternoon. Welcome to our final Sustainability, Housing, Efficiency, and Neighborhood Subcommittee of 2016. Thank you all for joining us. We have another full agenda today. Councilwoman Stark and Councilman Waring are here with us, and Councilman Valenzuela is going to be joining us telephonically. There's some great information in the packet on a variety of housing issues, which is seeming to be our primary theme today, is all the great work doing on housing and homelessness in the Phoenix area. So I'd encourage people to review that information in the packet. And we'll begin with a call to the public. So Sheila Harris.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Gallego and members of the subcommittee. I'm Sheila Harris of Sheila D. Harris Consulting Services. I'm coming to you today during the call to the public because of a timely issue regarding the low-income housing tax credit program and the applications which are due to the City of Phoenix on January 6th for matching funds using the HOME program to help make those projects viable. I'd like to read to you a short letter which I will then forward to you so you can have it for the record. This is a letter that West Cap Investments, Bill Spreitzer, will be sending to the Arizona Department of Housing. Dear Jeannie Redondo, she is the director of the tax credit program for the state. I have contacted the following low-income housing tax credit investors in preparation for submitting a tax credit application to ADOH and a home loan from the City of Phoenix for the 2017 affordable housing projects. He has contacted Wells Fargo Bank, Enterprise Community Investments, Redstone Equity Partners, City Real Estate Advisors. The purpose of the calls was to determine what equity pricing would be available and reasonable to include within applications for 2017. All investors gave me the same information, which is complete uncertainty in the market due to potential lowering of the corporate tax rate proposed by the pending new government administration to take over in January of 2017. Many investors have left the market entirely, and the ones that remain will not commit to firm pricing until they see what will be happening in the first part of next year. I have been advised that Chase Bank has repriced deals at the closing table for projects closing after the election in November and reduced their pricing by at least 12 cents. Investors indicated that if you were to underwrite a project today, the pricing of 85 to 90 cents would be in the ballpark. Just for an FYI, people were getting, prior to this, quotes of between $1 and $1.10. So that's a significant drop in the investment, which is a 20% drop in pricing from what was available prior to the election. The problem is there are no guarantees that this rate would be held at closing. Investors will reserve the right to change pricing with any commitment letter they provide, in fact, if they even provide one. Due to this uncertainty in the equity market for tax credits, I propose that ADOH strongly consider postponing the application due date to July 1st of 2017, allowing for the market to stabilize and for investors to be able to determine if they want to stay in the market and what pricing they're willing to do. I would encourage you to speak with the City of Phoenix regarding this matter. Also, their home applications are due January 6, 2017, and it's going to be difficult to get any definitive equity pricing by that date. We're asking the city to also postpone their deadline for home applications for the same reason. I understand the state of Colorado is considering postponing their application due date. Their standard date is May 1, 2017. Thank you for consideration of this issue. Any of the tax credit investors listed above would be happy to speak with you regarding this problem. Let me know if I can provide names and phone numbers for you to contact. I have also spoken to others in the tax credit world. Not everyone is in agreement about postponing it, but we definitely need to have a conversation regarding the situation that this places both the City of Phoenix as well as the Department of Housing, because we need this very important resource in our community, and we need to come up with a solution rather quickly, because 30 days from now, the applications are due to the City of Phoenix regarding home funds, which are critical as match to make any tax credit project viable.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you.
It's my understanding our team is already actively talking with the community. These are very important projects for us, and we want to make sure they are successful. So more to come. Unfortunately, this body will not have the ability to weigh in on that due to meeting timelines, but we will make sure we keep the business community updated. With that, we have the meeting minutes from our November 15th meeting. Would entertain a motion to approve those.
Move to approve.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Meeting minutes pass. We have a consent item, or 3 consent items on the agenda today. Would anyone like to pull out anything from the consent agenda?
I'd like to pull 2 and 3.
Wonderful. We will have individual votes on items 2 and 3, so I would entertain a motion on the one remaining item of 4.
I was gonna say, we have the individuals on all 3?
Yes, I guess that would, the mathematically works out. We can just go in order then. All right, we'll do item agenda 2. Would you like the presentation or just a vote?
Can I ask a question?
Please, could we welcome our housing
I don't know who-
director,
I guess Cindy.
Cindy Stotler? And this is our section 32.
So, sorry.
And maybe we could you give us a 2-sentence overview? For those of us who have been on the subcommittee, this is something we worked on before, but it's new to many of the people here today.
Thank you, Vice Mayor and members of the council. The Section 32 program is a homeownership program where we are selling previous public housing, single-family homes that were used for public housing to low-income home buyers as a first-time home buyer program at a significant discount and with significant rehabilitation in order to make the home buying experience the most optimal. So we have had this program running for a couple of years. We recently got an expansion, so we have a total of 299 homes that are approved for sale through this program. And what we're finding lately is that some of the homes are sitting on the market for over 180 days because they are priced at appraised value. And sometimes the appraised value is overstated based on investments in the home, in the neighborhood where people are coming in and flipping homes. And so it's overpricing some of the homes, and our low-income home buyers not being able to afford that level of home. So what we're asking for is an ability to discount after 180 days, to discount incrementally over the next 60 days, 120 days, and discount the home a little bit off the appraised value just to make sure that we can sell it to a qualified low-income home buyer. The second thing that we're asking for is to adjust the plan where we originally stated that you had to be a low-income homebuyer with wages at a certain amount, 30% of area median income or 50% of area median income. What we're finding is that many of our potential homebuyers are on a fixed income for disability or veterans pension or something like that. So it's not technically wages, but it is a reliable income, and we like to be able to qualify those folks for a low-income affordable house. So those are the 2 things we're asking for today.
So if I can. So I guess maybe since you started with the second part first, it makes me a little nervous. It seems like the city will be in the role of kind of a realtor or something like that, changing the prices. It seems a little arbitrary. I don't know. I mean, I can see why before you had an appraisal and it was going to be a set price and so forth. Now we're changing that. I'm assuming the reasoning we had the system set up the way it was before was to avoid this very thing. And you are trying to manage a whole bunch of houses, so whoever's doing this has kind of a portfolio. Are they prepared to be doing this, or is it just a formula, however many days, and you're lopping off a couple percent, which also doesn't seem very...
Councilman, it is a formula of after so many days, you're lopping off a certain percent, and that was dictated to us by HUD when we called them and asked them if there was something we could do about this appraisal value. So they said, yes, you could do a certain amount in 60 days, another certain amount in 120 days, and no more than this much amount after 250 days, something like that. So it's a formula that they gave us.
So this is going on in other states and other cities, and that's the program that they're using to solve the problem?
I can't for sure tell you that it's going on in other cities, but it was something that they came up with when we called them and told them the problem we were having, so I assume that they have used it in other jurisdictions.
I mean, I guess I'd feel better, we don't know that this is going to solve the problem, but it will reduce the price that you're getting for the houses. Okay, the first part, I understand the 100% disabled veteran example that you've got in here, but I assume part of why the part about earning income was to have people be kind of vested too in this. I'm guessing, I wasn't here when this was set up, and we're kind of taking that away a little bit, I mean, to my mind. Do you want to just speak to that?
So Vice Mayor and members of the subcommittee, the purpose was to sell these homes to low-income home buyers. So low-income home buyer, regardless of how you achieve your income. I think we mistakenly just put in wages at a certain amount instead of saying income. And that word has prevented a number of folks who would otherwise qualify for these homes to qualify because they don't earn technically wages, they earn income in other manners through Social Security, pension, disability, what have you. But that income is guaranteed and they do qualify, otherwise qualify for a regular mortgage. So we would like to qualify them to buy these homes.
Okay. So it was really just the wrong use of a word.
Yes.
I still have concerns about the first thing we talked about, which is actually the second thing you mentioned here. But okay, I think that answers my questions anyway.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
We ready for a motion on this item?
I will move to approve.
Second? All in favor, please say aye. All opposed?
No,
Passes 2-1.
I just need to vote on the next one.
Wonderful. The next item is our membership in the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. Would we entertain a motion to renew our membership?
So moved.
Second? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
No,
Passes 2-1. And then our property management services contract for the affordable housing proposal. Would anyone like a presentation on this one? All right, would entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Passes
yeah, that's fine.
3-0.
They're all, yeah.
All right, and then we have a presentation I think many people have been looking forward to on family homelessness in the Maricopa region, where we've had a great partnership, and I think this will be a great opportunity to raise awareness of some of the successes we've had and perhaps models that we can look to other homeless populations. So we'll welcome our Human Service Director and let Mo Gallegos introduce the people who are here with him.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for your time. As always, we appreciate it. And the purpose of this item, as you indicated, is to provide a status of on the families who are experiencing homelessness in our region. We do have with us UMOM Chief Executive Director Darlene Newsome and Maddie Lord, the Chief Program Officer for UMOM. UMOM has been at the center of the development of the Family Housing Hub. This is a community-wide participatory process that has brought so much rich data about families, and they're going to talk about that in just a moment. But before we do that, I'm going to have Ryan Balch, our Deputy Director over Victim and Homeless Services, provide you just a summary of the City of Phoenix resources that we do put to the effort of family homelessness.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, it's really nice to be here today to talk a little bit about family homelessness, and even nicer to have our partners with us who really are the ones providing the services every day on the front line to, tell you what reality looks like. Click this slide. There we go. So before they get started, though, I just wanted to provide you a quick overview of the city's contribution to ending family homelessness, to provide you some context as they talk about what they do. The city provides homeless services in a variety of ways. So we participate in community planning and governance. We also do provide some direct services. Many of you are familiar with the outreach services that we provide. And also we have contracts for services, mostly federal funds and some local funds as well. Currently, we have about $1 million in funds specifically for families. And that's in 3 different contracts for shelter, and it's just over 300 beds of emergency shelter for families in our community. We've also made a really significant investment in providing permanent and permanent supportive housing for families. And it's hard to value exactly what a voucher is worth, but we estimate that that's worth about $365,000 annually. And these are really high need families who are going to need support to remain stable in housing. And as you can see, we have about 53 Section 8 vouchers out there in our community. So we've made a lot of progress. We're really proud of all of our efforts. However, we're still not able to house every single family every single night like we all would like. And we know that because of strong partners like UMOM who have collected data and really can tell us what that scenario looks like. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darlene, Chief Executive Officer of UMOM.
Okay, Madam Chair, committee members. I'm first going to talk a little bit about the numbers. And, most of us, when we think about homelessness, you don't think about families, you don't think about youth. But actually, the numbers show different. And we all are familiar with the HMIS system, the Homeless Information System, that collects data on homelessness here in Maricopa County. And the Homeless Management Information System actually says that 41% of our homeless population are families. That's significant. The point in time survey that's done every year in January, which the city is a great collaborator in that, shows that persons in families, 37%. Those are significant numbers. So a number of people, when you think about homelessness, do fit in that family category. And our educational data is showing that last school year, over 18,000 students were counted in Maricopa County as being homeless. To me, that is very significant. And any homeless child on the street is significant, and we need to do something about that. But I'm gonna introduce Maddie Lord, who's our Chief Program Officer at UMOM, and we've collected data for 2 years, and we have great information to share with you today. Maddie?
Thank you, Darlene. So in the next slide, you'll see what I think is some of the most meaningful data we've ever had on family homelessness in Maricopa County. And really, we lead the country in having this quality of data over this sustained period of time. So the family providers have been working together very closely since August of 2014. And because we're working together and all families come through a single point of entry, we're able to actually track the volume of families slipping into homelessness on every single week for the last year and a half. And you can see that we've averaged it out now we can estimate that 47 new families will slip into homelessness in Maricopa County on any given week. And that's a really important number for us to know. Is my mic not on? Sorry. That's a very important number to know for community planning purposes. So this is happening with consistency. You can see the red line is a little bit lower than last year. It's leveled off a bit as we've been working together. I think it's no surprise to anyone that homelessness is very hard on our children. It affects their academic achievement and performance. They're more likely to drop out of school, witness violence, be involved with the child welfare system. They're more likely to have emotional issues and to need physical health issues addressed, and they're less likely to be able to access physical and behavioral health care. In addition to that social cost of experiencing homelessness, there was a study out of Pennsylvania with a similar economy to Maricopa County that said the marginal cost of a homeless child is $37,000 per child per year. So it's also very expensive for children to experience homelessness. The good news is that housing alone as a single intervention positively impacts all of these outcome measures. So with a single intervention of housing, we can really make a difference in the lives of these children, which impacts the entire course of their life. It's a long-term investment. Unfortunately, as I'm sure is no surprise to this subcommittee, there isn't enough affordable housing in Maricopa County. These are two different data sources I've pulled from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. You can see that in Maricopa County, a single parent would need to earn about $17.58 and able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. That's well out of range for many of the families that we serve. And additionally, we have only 18% of what's needed for very low income households in the region. So the family providers that serve homeless families in Maricopa County have been working together, as I said, very closely since 2010. We opened a coordinated entry site called the Family Housing Hub in 2014. Through this system, we are filling all the vacancies at all of these different entities. So there's 12 agencies operating 26 distinctly different programs and filling all of their vacancies from shared lists. Additionally, we've onboarded some additional housing partners with the City of Phoenix, the Housing Authority, and Mercy Maricopa, which is the Regional Behavioral Health Authority. So we have a pretty healthy portfolio of resources that we're able to make available to families experiencing homelessness. Together, because we're using all those resources together, we're able to shrink the problem, and this gives you just a snapshot of our work together. From January through October of this year, we had 3,238 families walk through the door. Of them, 2,600 families were actively experiencing homelessness. Of those 2,600 families, we were able to divert 1,013 of them from the system. Prior to working together, if we encountered a homeless family, we drove them into shelter before we allowed them to meet with a specialist. That doesn't make a lot of sense because often they just need a one-time case management appointment to help them troubleshoot and problem solve. Now we're doing that with them on the front end before we drive them into the system. And as you can see, with 1,000 families already this year, we were able to help them troubleshoot, problem solve, and keep them out of the system Sometimes they just need affordable housing recommendations, or they need somebody to point them in a direction of where they can find employment, or they need some help navigating a tricky relationship with their family. And now we're doing that on the front end. And that alone has resulted in a cost savings of about $6 million so far this year. So we're working really, really hard to make sure the resources we have are reserved for the families who truly have no other option. So that left us with 1,674 families experiencing homelessness that we were unable to divert, who needed some service from our system. So those families were formally assessed so we could match the resource to their service needs, so that we were making sure to give everybody the right dose of what they need and nothing more than that. So we're right-sizing the intervention for every individual family. Unfortunately, given our portfolio, there's still not enough to be able to serve anybody immediately. Diversion is the only thing we have immediately available to a homeless family. So as those 47 families slip into homelessness, the ones that are not diverted are actively waiting for a resource. This gives you just a sample of the number of families that are waiting and for how long they're waiting for each intervention. So as you can see, the last week in September, there were 158 families waiting to access what's ironically named emergency shelter now. They were waiting between 2 weeks to 3.5 months, depending on eligibility criteria, the size of their family, whether or not where they're staying is safe, and a variety of other factors. We had 155 families waiting for rapid rehousing, 97 waiting for extended shelter, and those are pretty complicated families, and 23 waiting for permanent supportive housing that Ryan mentioned earlier. The good news is, if we look at the veteran families, because the portfolio for veteran families is right-sized, we have very few families and they don't wait for any period of time. This is what we want for all families. We want to right-size the community portfolio so that no family has to wait to access the resources they need to immediately end their homelessness. Families go unsheltered every day. I think it's obvious. We see unsheltered single homelessness quite regularly, but we don't see the families on the streets, and so we don't often realize they even exist. I can tell you right now we have 184 families waiting to access emergency shelter. That's 408 children. And of those families, 28 are actually living on the streets or in places not meant for human habitation. And even the ones that are unsheltered are having to wait 2 to 3 weeks for this emergency shelter. I'll introduce you to just a couple of unsheltered families. These pictures came to us from Project Hope with the Salvation Army, who does the outreach for the Family Housing Hub. This is a family of 6 that's been sleeping in their vehicle at a truck stop off of I-10. Both adults are working, all 4 kids are in school. If you happen to be at the truck stop at I-10 getting gas, and you saw this family, what might you assume?
Traveling.
You would think they were going to Disneyland, moving across the country. You would see them with your eyes, but not realize that was actually an unsheltered homeless family. Here's another one. This is a single mom with 4 kids. She is employed full-time at a child care center where they've given her permission for her and her children to spread out the mats in the hallway and sleep in the hallway of the child care center. Additionally, they store their belongings in the cargo van that belongs to the child care center. For a day or two, this arrangement might be okay, but because she's having to wait 2 to 3 weeks, she's jeopardizing her employment, her relationship with her colleagues, etc. This is another unsheltered homeless family that we would never see because they're actually within a child care center. So the family providers find this to be unacceptable, so we hired a data analyst to take a look at the portfolio of resources we have in this community, to take a look at all of the assessment data that's been available since August of 2014, and to do an analysis of what we would need to right-size the community portfolio. What would it take to have all the resources on hand so that as those 47 families slip into homelessness, we could catch them immediately and nobody would have to wait for what they need? And the data analysis shows that we need to hold on to everything that we currently have and add 17 more units of emergency shelter, 209 more units of rapid rehousing, 68 units of extended shelter, and 15 more units of permanent supportive housing. And what would that cost? We took an estimate by using UMOM's approximate cost for each of these interventions, and we cost the whole thing out. It would be an additional $4.4 million per year to be able to right-size our interventions and effectively end unsheltered family homelessness.
So a solution to the problem is first off, I want to thank the city for their support for family homelessness and the resources that you've designated thus far. But it's important that we retain all the resources that we have. We don't lose any of those resources. We need to prioritize the $4.4 million additional funding because we need to right-size the interventions. And also, we really need to expect strong outcome measures from all our programs and all our contracts to make sure that those dollars are the best used and they're just not managing our homeless, but they're actually ending their homelessness. And that's a real important factor. And so to me, to be able to be in this position, I think we are the first in the nation to have this kind of analysis and to have this kind of information that we need to say, what is it going to take to end family homelessness? And this is what this presentation is all about. Thank you.
Longtime leaders at the City of Phoenix, former Councilman Craig Tripp.
Vice Mayor Gallego and committee members, I want to compliment you, Mom, for having such great information. I think, as Mo said, this really points the way to how we're going to address homelessness throughout the city. And the $4 million that was mentioned for rapid rehousing is really going to be a small piece of what's going to be needed in the final analysis. Unfortunately, I hate to say that. We do see about 4,700 unduplicated individuals in a year down at the emergency shelter, and we'd like to, I just think it's important to keep in mind that this effort that UMOM is showing and the data that they're showing is really an important flashlight down the road as to how we're going to really address homelessness in the long run. And I really appreciate what they've done with regards to giving us real hard data as to what works and what doesn't work. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. It is fabulous to have data so we can understand, celebrate the progress we've made, but understand we still have a long way to go. And we obviously are the Phoenix City Council, but we have partners in many communities, including the Board of Supervisors. Could you just talk a little bit about what's happening in the rest of Maricopa counties, because we're more familiar with what Phoenix is doing?
Well, I think that, you know, for the list of partners that we have, I think that's an important
And maybe we
piece
go back to the,
of our partners, because this isn't just about you, Mom. It's about all our different partners we
We
have.
go back
Do we
to the
wanna go back to
slide
that
with-
slide?
I'm sorry.
And so one of the things that we have done is that's a Standing Strong for Families group. And they all have had this presentation. The next step of that group is to take that presentation to their board of directors and take that information to the Mesa City Council, the Glendale City Council, because this is a regional issue. It's just not a Phoenix issue. And as you can see, many of the programs that we have as part of our partnerships, many of them have locations in the East and the West Valley. And so this is just the beginning. This is information that we've presented to the Continuum of Care Board. We present it to foundations. And we've also presented it to some private individuals. So it's always going to take a little bit from everywhere to end homelessness. It's just not one pocket that's going to do this. We're also working on some state legislation some additional funding that we could maybe ask through the Arizona Lottery, because they already do fund $1 million into homeless services. And so we have an effort, we have a momentum, and this is one of our stops as far as making our presentation so we can actually come up with that $4.4 million pocket. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think we
Yeah.
just always like to talk about that it's a regional problem.
It's
and
a
needs to
regional
be-
issue, absolutely.
I'm very proud that the city has taken a leadership role, but not everyone was living in Phoenix before they became homeless, and we might share they have housing opportunities in the communities where they are.
We also have pretty good data from this collaboration to show that about half of the homeless families are from Phoenix, about 30% from the East Valley, and 20% from the West Valley. So we are absolutely able to illustrate the regionalization with our data.
And how does that align with the available beds, or do we know?
There's a disproportionate amount of resources in the East Valley.
And maybe
Surprisingly.
that's,
Mhm.
But we're able to at least do that analysis now, whereas we previously couldn't.
and we're really seeing most of the families were in Maricopa County before they became housing challenged or homeless.
Correct.
Because I think with some of our single men, they weren't necessarily.
Right, yeah, no, it's a lot of families who live in Maricopa County.
Great. Any questions from my colleagues? And do we have Councilman Valenzuela?
Vice Mayor, can you hear me?
Wonderful, yes. I know this is
Yeah.
an issue you've spent some time on. Any questions?
Yeah, I've been on from the beginning of the meeting, but I realized that no one could hear me, so I had to call back in. But so I'm glad you can hear me now. I'd like to thank UMOM. I'd like to thank all the partners that continue to work in this effort and continue to lead by example. Of course, the City of Phoenix has been a partner, but I think this truly has been led by organizations such as UMOM, and I am 100% supportive.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you
Thank
for
you.
your work on this issue. Please keep us apprised, and also as you're down at the state legislature, we can stay in touch with our team down there as well. I do not have any additional cards on this item.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So we do have an additional card on item 10 from Greta Rogers. So we'll, all right, next we will move to Phoenix Starfish Place. And then after that, I may take an item out of order, which is the local bank deposit program. So that is currently agendized as item number 9 and would move to item number 7. That works for. We'll have Cindy Stutler, our housing director, kick us off.
Thank you, Vice Mayor, members of the subcommittee. I am up here with Mo Gallegos, the Director of Human Services, Chris Hallett, Director of Neighborhood Services Department, and Associate Professor at ASU, Dominique Rose Sepowitz. We are all up here today because we are very excited to present you with this opportunity that we have, that we've been working on through this strong partnership that we have to provide permanent supportive housing for a very special population. And in order to get here, I don't have the clicker. Can I have the clicker? In order to get here, 3 things had to happen to get us to this point, and I'm going to give you a little background. Back in June, we had presented an update on Section 8 vouchers to the subcommittee, and were directed at that time to take some of the successes that we had had with the homeless vouchers and permanent supportive housing for homeless to other populations that were a priority for the council, namely domestic violence and human trafficking populations, to see what we could do. So that was the first thing that happened, was getting that direction and trying to figure out what we could do. Then as soon as we talk about victims of domestic violence, victims of human trafficking, I go to my friend here, Mo Gallegos, over Human Services, to educate me on those victims, to see what kind of housing needs that they have. So while we were talking about this, one other significant thing happened, and that was that HUD defunded transitional housing for homeless populations, and they put all their funding into rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. So in defunding transitional housing, some of our partners lost their money and subsequently had to give up some property. And one of those partners was the Foundation for Senior Living. They had recently built, in 2013, built a 15-unit transitional supportive housing property up in District 3. And they lost their funding and had to go, it was vacant. So they were calling me about this vacant property and trying to find ideas of what to do with it. One of the reasons they were calling me is because we were the primary lender. City of Phoenix, through Home and CDBG, loaned them $2.38 million to build this property. They had a little over $300,000 in equity, and what they were trying to do was figure out what to do with this property and get their equity out of it and just kind of get out of the whole thing because they had no funding anymore. At the same time, another thing happened. HUD passed their HOTMA bill, which is Housing Opportunities Through Modernization Act, and in that HOTMA bill, they allowed public housing authorities to place Section 8 vouchers in their public housing authority owned properties with no competitive process. So with that, I'm looking at this opportunity saying, okay, we already pretty much own it as the primary lender. And if I have the opportunity to put Section 8 vouchers, I could actually provide permanent supportive housing for a special population. So then it came down to which population. And again, I turned to my friend here, Mo Gallegos, to talk about which population would benefit most from a permanent supportive housing opportunity like this. And I'm going to turn it over to Mo now to talk about that population.
Thank you, Cindy. Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, Cindy indicated we're asking to use this valuable resource to help victims of human trafficking. And human trafficking can take many types of forms, such as labor trafficking, but one of the most horrific is sex trafficking. It affects our most innocent children who are under the age of 18, who are induced into commercial sex. And of course, it also affects adults through force, fraud, and coercion. Just some statistics that are really startling, but I think it's important for us to kind of face is that one of the most startling is that in Arizona, the average age of an individual entering into sex trafficking is 14 years old. So you can imagine your own child, your niece, nephew, your brother or sister having to deal with anything like this at 14 years of age. It's really hard to even imagine. A few weeks ago, we presented to you the status of youth homelessness in our region. And here we see that 1 in 4 homeless young adults have experienced sex trafficking in their experience in homelessness. And if that isn't startling enough, 1 in 3 teens, if they go into the streets within 48 hours, there's an attempt to lure them into trafficking. All of these statistics, of course, they make us cringe, and they should. And so the city of Phoenix, as usual, steps up, and the city first started looking at sex trafficking, human trafficking, with regards to the Super Bowl a few years back when it was going to come to Arizona. But quickly, very quickly, the city leaders, you all, really learned that it's not a Super Bowl issue, it's not an event issue, it's really something that happens every day across our state, every day across our nation. That's why the mayor and the city council, you appointed a human trafficking task force to steer our community in addressing and combating and preventing human trafficking. Councilman Waring on the subcommittee is in fact the chair of this task force, which I believe personally is just as strong today as the day that it started. I remember clearly when he took over the task force, he said, I'll take it with only one condition, and that's if we take action. And it clearly has taken action. The mission of the group is to establish Phoenix as a model. To accomplish this, it was really critically important to create a comprehensive plan, which was collaborative, that would include all partners that are willing to come to the table. Equally important, though, is to acknowledge and realize the great work that is really and had been going on, but wanting to reach beyond that existing work and find innovative ways to address this critically important issue, ensuring that at the end of the day, we would be able to make a substantial culture change, which we all agree that human trafficking is unacceptable in our community. So this endeavor to address human trafficking through housing resources is just one more example of a persistent focus on innovation that will change our culture and really change how we view and how we deal with victims of human trafficking. So I'll turn it back over to Cindy to continue down this road.
Thank you, Mo. So we have identified the population that we want to house in this permanent supportive housing, and this is where the partnership came in, because there are many needs and there are a lot of complexities that has to do with setting up a property like this and providing permanent supportive housing for a population that we've never served before. So one of the things we needed was we needed to purchase the equity from the Foundation for Senior Living, a little over $300,000. The Housing Department has many resources through HUD, but they are dedicated to public housing and Section 8 housing, and we had no extra money to fund that. So I called my good friend Chris Hallett in Neighborhood Services, and thank goodness he still picks up the phone when I call him. And is there any way we can find the money to do this? This is a wonderful project. Chris said it's the time of year when when he has seen a lot of spending in the critical core city department funding, and it's time to reprogram usually at that point, because a lot of people don't spend all the money they had budgeted. He thought that for sure they could reprogram enough to let us buy this for up to $325,000. So that was the beginning of, okay, this can actually really happen. We are in the business of affordable housing, so we have no problem owning and operating this. We have a property manager, Dunlap and McGee, that works for us. We just awarded that contract. They do affordable and public housing and permanent supportive housing. They're very good at what they do. So we have the ability to own and manage this property very easily. And with the Section 8 vouchers that we can place now with the HOTMA rule, this property can be sustainable through rent. So obviously victims such as human trafficking victims are coming out of transitional housing and they are not going to have jobs, most of them, or maybe they have just gotten a job. They are not going to be able to pay a lot of rent. So the Section 8 voucher will handle much of that rent, and whatever 30% of their income that can go towards rent will go towards rent, and their Section 8 voucher will cover the rest. But that makes it so this property will be sustainable without using any general funds or any extra funding. Then we have to provide casework services. So when permanent supportive housing requires casework services, specialized casework services for these victims of human trafficking, that's where I have to look at human services to help us manage that, to do the request for proposals and manage the contract like they do with the homeless. And they stepped up and said absolutely they would do that. And last, we brought in Dominique from ASU, who is in the Office of Sex Trafficking Intervention Research at ASU, and she is helping us with the program design and training us. She trained all of us yesterday for 3 hours, and she will continue to train us in dealing with these very needy population that we don't know much about. So there's a lot of things that we learned yesterday that will help us better manage the property and better set it up for security and other things that this population will need. So it's been very beneficial. Just to tell you, the property could not be built any better. I mean, with our wish list was fulfilled with what they have built on this property already. It's a 15-unit family property. There are 3 units that are 3-bedroom, and the rest are 2-bedroom, so it's definitely family. There's a community center with a large community room, a demonstration kitchen, a pantry for food and for clothing, because it was transitional homeless before, so they have racks for clothing, which I believe we're going to need for this population as well. It has a library, a very large library, and a computer center in that library, and Foundation for Senior Living is going to leave us the computers for this group to use. They have plenty of offices for caseworkers, 2 offices with the doors that can close for special services. They have 2 training rooms as well. And last but not least, they actually have a child care center that's already built into this property that we are working. Mo is working very diligently to find a provider that can provide child care for our victims, so that will help them on the path to self-sufficiency. So the whole goal here is taking them from transitional housing into permanent supportive housing to get them back on their feet and become self-sufficient and eventually, hopefully, independent from assisted housing. Some of the requirements to achieving self-sufficiency for working mothers, as we all know, is childcare. So that's at a premium for this. We are really working hard to get a contract, get somebody in to provide that childcare service so that these women can go get an education or go look for jobs and work without worrying about childcare. So very excited about that. For supportive services, again, I had to call Chris, and he did pick up the phone for the second time. Thank you, Chris. We are proposing to use $150,000 in community development block grant funds for the services. It has already been allocated by council for domestic violence or human trafficking services, and what we'd like to do is pull it out of that general allocation and put it into a dedicated allocation for this service for human trafficking victims at this property. Human Services would do or issue the request for proposals for a service provider. We are looking for a service provider that can provide trauma-informed case management specifically for human trafficking victims, that can work with us on eligibility criteria and applications for the Section 8 program, because they still will have to qualify for the Section 8 program. And hopefully they can provide services aimed at achieving self-sufficiency. As I said, our whole goal is to get them back on their feet and eventually independent from assisted housing. Human Services will use their general evaluation criteria that they use for the homeless service providers and other service providers for casework such as this: organizational capacity, service approach, fiscal capacity, and will be their total available points. We would love it if some of these service providers had other funding that they could leverage with our $150,000 to provide even more services, such as daycare services, so we will be looking for that. As far as the timeline, we are looking at, if this is approved by council, we are looking at issuing the RFP in February for the services, so we can get that going and get somebody on board and figure out how it's going to be implemented. Housing believes we can close on the deal and own the property by March of 2017, and that will give us a few months to set everything in place and set up contracts, furnish the place, and find supplies so that we can open for occupancy in July of 2017. Since Dominique Rose-Sepowitz is here from ASU, I would like to turn it over to her for a few minutes to talk about ASU's partnership in this and how she's helping us set this whole program up.
Thank you for, there. Thank you for having me. I want to tell you a little bit of background about ASU's partnership with the city. We have worked really beautifully together on a very complex problem. We have a small research office at ASU. We have about $2 million worth of funding from all over HHS and private funders as well. And what we're trying to do is solve some of the challenges to exiting prostitution and trafficking situations. So we work very closely with law enforcement, including the Phoenix Police Department, the city, really innovative in trying to solve a really long-standing problem in our world. The reason that we came together and named this the Starfish Place is that the starfish is really the basis for our work. It's the story of the starfish. I'm sure everyone's heard it. A little boy walking down the beach throwing starfish in after a big storm. There are thousands of starfish, and an old man walks up and says, "Why are you bothering? You can't save those thousands of starfish." And the little boy says, "Well, I can certainly help this one," and throws it in the water. And I'm a social worker. I'm not a rescuer. I don't I don't believe that we can do that type of rescue. I think law enforcement and the FBI and other people can. But when they hit the water, we can say, what can we do so you don't get washed up again? And what we would like to offer in partnership is to evaluate the program from a housing protocol as well as mental health services. We'd like to create partnerships with different medical providers and mental health providers to come in and provide it. And I've asked ASU, the president's office, we have a final call tomorrow for funding to support that work. We'd like to bring in someone to train us on something called the sanctuary model, which is a trauma-focused environmental model so that everyone who works there, including the security, including anyone who has anything to do with client behavior or client response, is trained on the understanding that if someone is standing outside their apartment and they're upset, that they're not doing it to make everyone mad. There's probably something going on. And if we can kind of let that be and try to see it through a trauma-focused lens, I think we can really gain. So just to illustrate the need in our community, we had our fourth drop-in center on Saturday at the Helen Drake Senior Center, another great illustration of how ASU and 20 organizations and the city partner to serve sex trafficked and prostituted persons. And we had 58 people drop into our center. 58 people who self-identified as being trafficked and prostituted in their lifetime. We had men, mostly women. We had women with children. We had infants. We had 5-year-olds. We had a 4-year-old with a mother. And it was really remarkable. What it constantly reminds us is that loose housing, hotels, short-term housing is really where our clients sit. And with that, they don't even have a place to mail their check that's coming in 2 weeks. So if we can stabilize housing, and with ASU's partnership with all these other wonderful organizations, we can create MOUs. We're not just giving them a place to live, we're giving them a community to live in. And we know that is what they need. We've done the research. We can support it with evidence-based practices, that it's not just giving them a bed to sleep in that's safe. It's creating an environment of growth and an environment that propels them out of that life as opposed to back into that life. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dominique. So with that, we have a recommendation. This is a complex project, so this is a complex recommendation that we're proposing for you. Housing would like to acquire the Bridge Family Campus, which is the name of the campus from Foundation for Senior Living, and rename it to Phoenix Starfish Place. In order to acquire it, we would have to assume the loans that are existing on the property, the 2.38 from Home and CDBG from the Phoenix Housing Department, and $340,000 from a federal home loan bank. And in order to assume the loans from ourselves, we'd have to create a separate instrumentality. We call it an LLC. So it would be Phoenix Starfish Place LLC, and that organization would assume the loans, and we would run the organization. We would like to reprogram $325,000 in CDBG Community Development Block Grant funds from core city core department programs to purchase the property from Foundation for Senior Living. We also need approval to amend and assume the existing loans to the Phoenix Starfish Place LLC. We are seeking approval to allocate 15 Section 8 project-based vouchers to make the project sustainable and to pay rent. We are asking to reallocate $150,000 of CDBG funds from domestic violence and human trafficking RFP service or proposal services out there to supportive services directly for human trafficking at this site. And then lastly, for Human Services Department to issue the supportive services request for proposal, award the bid, and enter into the contract for services. So it is a complex and ambitious recommendation. I appreciate that. But this may be the first of its kind in the nation, this permanent supportive housing for victims of human trafficking. We have not found anything like it in the nation. It's pretty exciting to be doing this for folks that are very needy. we want to thank you. We are excited about this partnership. We've been working on this for several months, and we're all very excited about it. We want to thank you for your guidance. If you had not asked us to go look for other things that we could do for victims, we would not have gone this direction. So we appreciate your guidance, and we thank you for helping us with this, creating this opportunity to make a huge difference in 15 families' lives.
Wonderful, thank you. And this is exciting. We just challenged you this year to look at human trafficking, which has been a priority area for the city for many years, but we've not yet turned to the housing department. It's also the first year where we allocated community development block grants to look at this important issue. And so it's quite impressive, I think, to me, that how quickly this came together, because it's clearly a very complex project. So thank you. This was a great example of the city working together across multiple departments and with other partners on a pretty compact time frame and taking advantage of what might have been a difficult situation with changes at the federal level to come up with a good use for a property. So thank you for your work on this issue. Property occurs in District 3, so turn it over to our District 3 expert.
Thank you. And just for the record, I see we have a letter here from the co-chairs of the Arizona Governor's Council. It was sent to our chair of the Mayor's Task Force, Councilman Waring. And Councilman Waring was very wise in saying, let's do this slowly. Let's make sure we're having open houses. Let's make sure we've got the neighborhood involved. And we did. I actually went to one of the neighborhood meetings. I think no one showed up, but I think that's a testament to the property. It's a very nice, well-kept piece of property, and I think you really did do your due diligence. Again, we would have owned the property anyway because we originally loaned the money to. So, but I'm happy to make a motion unless the councilman has anything.
I just want to say 10 seconds worth of
Sure.
thing. Thank you. It's not my district, so I was being a little bit of a Baninsky, but
No, I'm glad you
but
were.
it kind of came in during your transition period, and so I felt it was appropriate to make sure that the neighbors of the surrounding facility knew kind of what the deal was. Obviously, you had the public meetings and everything was fine, but I think it's a great opportunity. I appreciate you guys sitting at the table who identified it and came up with this. But again, just 5 more seconds, if you'll indulge me. People just don't, I didn't realize till I became chair of the task force. I worked a lot on domestic violence when I was at the legislature, but people don't realize how vile this human trafficking issue is. Things that I see on TV shows now or in movies that I would have thought are somewhat overstated and so forth, I now find are probably understated and in real life. I mean, it's horrifying. Remember, statistically speaking, most of the people who wind up staying here got into this as kids because they were lured into it or their parents traded them for drugs or something just completely just abhorrent. And anything we can do as a society to help them pull out of that. We talked about the homeless issue, which is also, it's expensive, $37,000 a child and so forth. This is just, this is something that if we can head that off and get these people headed on a better path, some would look at them as, at least in some cases, criminals because they engaged in prostitution or something. But I think probably the appropriate word is victims. And the horrors that we've had, just personal testimonies at both the state and the city task force, it's kind of unbelievable. People can even survive that and go on to live productive lives. But with right services, we found that they can. And so this helps with that, and appreciate all your efforts. That was more than 5 seconds, so I apologize.
You, as our leader on human
My
trafficking,
6-year-olds would have called me on that too, so.
I feel like you earned
It
5
wasn't
minutes.
6 seconds,
if you-
Dad, or whatever.
And we certainly
I
appreciate
appreciate that. Thank
your
you.
leadership on human trafficking. I think it's exciting that this is the subcommittee that oversees human trafficking, and we found a way to leverage city funds that we were, non-general funds that we were already receiving to do this project in a creative way. So thank you all for.
Yeah, and that's important. Take 5 more seconds. This is existing resources, nobody's raising taxes to this or anything, but this is a meritorious purpose for tax dollars, I think. So.
A project a fiscal conservative
Yeah,
could
fiscal
support. Yay, yay.
Yes.
Excellent. And we have a motion on the table. Any,
I so move all the recommendations to make this happen. Thank you.
and I guess Councilman Valenzuela, anything to add?
Thank you to everyone on this subcommittee. Councilman Waring, thank you. Of course, Councilwoman Stark is doing a great job in and you, Vice Mayor. This is important for the entire council, for the entire city. I want to thank our human services leaders with Mo Gallego and Sandy Stotler and everyone else who was involved. And I'm absolutely supportive here.
And we ought to recognize our Deputy City Manager, Deanna Jonovich, who has
There she is.
worked extensively on human trafficking and works with all of the departments here. So some excellent silo busting to come up with a creative solution from your team.
I just got a text from Deanna reminding me to thank her, so thank you.
Oh, if you
So-
could see her face right now.
I'm joking. Deanna's one of the most humble, hardest people we have at the city, so thank you, Deanna.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Passes unanimously. Thank you and congratulations. So next we are going to take one item out of order and go to our local bank deposit program, which is item number 9.
9. Okay, thank you. I'm losing track here. Okay, here we are. Yeah, gotcha. No, that makes sense.
It's a great opportunity of investing in Phoenix, and we will kick it off to Denise Olson, our Chief Financial Officer, to introduce our item.
Thank you, Vice Mayor, members of the subcommittee, and we appreciate this opportunity to give you an update on our local banking deposit program. This program began in July of 2012, and basically what happens is the City of Phoenix has monies that they actually deposit into local banks, and then this gives the banks additional capital, which they can then make loans and also invest in the community. So the benefits to the city is that all of our deposits are FDIC insured, and we actually earn an interest on these deposits. This program, we've seen a low of $5 million when the program first started in 2012, but it has grown over the years. We did have a peak of about $126 million that we had deposited in local banks. Now, these deposits will fluctuate year after year just based on short-term needs and also what's going on with the market. Currently, we have about 15 banks, and we have $105 million deposited in each of these banks. Now, in order to participate in this program, you basically have to have a branch in Maricopa County, and you also have to be able to compete with basically rates that are comparable to U.S. government-backed securities. So anyone can compete in this program if they have a branch in Maricopa County. So this gives you a chart of where our deposits are today. And you can see that there's probably about $80 million with Alliance Bank. We also have about $10 million with Metro Phoenix Bank. We have an amount with Kansas, Republic, and Meadows Bank. And then there's small deposits with various other banks in Maricopa County. So in the future, we plan on continuing to look at investment opportunities with local banks and where it works out and where it's advantageous for both for the City of Phoenix and for the local banks, we will continue to increase our deposits with these banks. And with that, we'll answer any questions.
Wonderful. And maybe before we turn to council member questions, can we welcome up Ed Zito? I'm a customer of Alliance Bank, so great to have you here with us.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. City Council Subcommittee, it's a pleasure to be here. Alliance Bank of Arizona is the largest locally headquartered bank in Arizona. We appreciate the city taking this initiative back in July of 2012 to launch the local bank deposit program. I'd just like to give you a crystallization of some of the benefits and the clients that have been effectively enabled by the program. As the city CFO said, we have about $80 million of city funds, fully FDIC insured, and earning interest, competitive interest rate. We also have invested about $20 million in the City of Phoenix investment securities. But the hallmark of the program was to recycle deposit dollars back into city businesses. So just to run down a little bit of what that involves and how meaningful this program has been. And I might also mention, after the City of Phoenix initiated the program, Many other cities throughout Arizona replicated this program, in some cases using the exact RFP or language that the city of Phoenix had devised. So again, hats off to you for your foresight and leadership. But we now have approximately $750 million in loan commitments within the boundaries of the city of Phoenix. And some of the clients I think you'll recognize. Victory Place, a 75-unit low-income housing project in South Phoenix. The Mountain Park Health Center, which is also geared to supply the low-income community with proper medical and health care. Specifically 2 sites, Maryvale and Gateway. Cutter Aviation, a major family-owned enterprise for about 88 years, is a major customer of the bank in here within the city of Phoenix. The redevelopment of Metro Center. I tried to pick some customers that are in many of the council's various districts, and forgive me if I missed any. But as you know, the council created the North Mountain redevelopment district a while back, and Metro Center is undergoing some major innovative overhaul and redevelopment, and we are the bank that's financing that. Town and Country Shopping Center up at 20th and Camelback. Our good client, Red Development, is doing that redevelopment. The Newton on 3rd Avenue and Camelback is an adaptive reuse project that we financed several years ago. Divine Transportation, the charter bus company, relocated from 7th Street over to the Black Canyon Highway and is also a major customer of the bank. The Nash on Roosevelt Row is another good example of the life and vibrancy in that neighborhood and our ability to both bank and assist the Nash. Camelhead Square at 44th and Camelback, and multiple, the bank actually works with, finances, and simply provides depository services to a multitude of nonprofit and municipal clients within the city of Phoenix.
Wonderful.
I'd be glad to take any questions, and I appreciate the time to support Denise and John and the very fine program that they instituted with your on the behalf of the city of Phoenix about 6 years ago now.
Wonderful. Well,
Or
thank
4
you
years
for
ago.
Illustrating why it's important to invest locally.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Any council member questions?
Vice Mayor?
Yeah, Councilman Valenzuela.
Thank you. I want to thank people, like to, of course, Ed Zerker, our city staff are focusing, especially in this area, as we continue to work with all of those drivers of our economy. Of course, the large businesses, but the foundation of our economy and economic development are our small businesses, and specifically those entrepreneurs that are putting, in many cases, everything at risk. And when I sit down with people who continue to make us a better city, and when I ask, what is the biggest thing they feel the city can be doing, they many times will point to this type of an effort. Putting some of our funds as much as possible into our local banks. And Alliance comes up quite a bit in those conversations. A lot of those businesses, as stated, but a lot of those businesses, wouldn't be driving us forward if it weren't for this type of a program and our continued efforts in this area. So, this is where it's at, as far as I'm concerned, to really help put people in a great position to succeed, and of course, helping the city succeed. So I'm absolutely supportive here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, it sounds like a very successful program, taking good care of Phoenix's funds, but also making sure that those funds are put to good use. Any final comments? Great. Thank you so much for that update. And now we will go back to our traditional agenda order and go to item number 7, section 8, Housing Choice Voucher Program Update and Allocation of Vouchers. And we're getting our money's worth out of our housing director, Cindy Stotler, today. Welcome back.
Thank you, Vice Mayor, members of the subcommittee. We'll continue the housing show with the Section 8 Housing Choice voucher program update. You'll recall, as I said earlier, we were last here in June to talk to you about what was going on with the Section 8 program. So we'll provide a couple of updates from the significant things that happened over the summer. First of all, I want to point out that we did achieve a high performer score from HUD this year again. HUD assesses us every year based on certain key factors that they're looking for a successful Section 8 program, mainly voucher utilization, reasonable rent, and quality inspections. And I do want to point out, with only 5 inspectors, we did 8,500 inspections last year. So we did certainly efficient and quality inspections. With me today is Nicole Ayula. She's the housing manager over Section 8 program, and I'm going to turn it over to her for the next couple of slides.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. We were here earlier this year to discuss the opening of the Section 8 waitlist after 11 years, and it has been a very busy year for the Section 8 program. And so we were able to open the waitlist beginning on August 8th for 2 weeks. In that time, we received more than 27,000 pre-applications, people who are interested in the Section 8 program. And we were able to go through those. There were some duplicates in that application process, so staff did have to go through those manually to remove the duplicates, at which time we were able to run a computerized lottery for 10,000 pre-applications to be placed on the 2016 Housing Choice Voucher waitlist, which is where we are today. It has been a bit of a process, but we are very proud of the work that we did. I'm very proud of the input that was provided by the community to help to make sure that we had the best platform in place for running this program. So we anticipate that we will begin issuing vouchers in about February. It does take a process to actually notify applicants that they were placed on the wait list. We did that through an electronic process on the phoenix.gov website on October 31st. And then all 10,000 people who were chosen in the lottery will also receive a letter in the mail, hopefully this week, if not next week, notifying them that they were actually placed on the wait list. So again, I think I mentioned that we had a pretty busy year in Section 8. With the charter change that took place last year, we were allowed to roll out electronic payments or direct deposits to our nearly 2,500 owners and property managers. We started with a pilot in August of this year, and we started with 65 landlords who decided that they wanted to see how this program would run. We've been testing it and vetting it for the last couple of months, and it's been very, very successful. Thank you to the assistance of the finance department staff who work on our behalf. We hope to be able to roll this out to the entire platform of all 2,500 by the end of next year, so the December of 2017. We're working on what that looks like as an electronic format. Right now it is a little more paper driven, so we're hoping that we can streamline the process and automate it. The program does issue approximately 4,000 checks per month. And so those are actual physical checks that staff have to touch and look and run and vet and reconcile. And so I think that this electronic direct deposit program will allow us to create some pretty significant efficiencies with that. And one of the other things we were able to do this year was to hire what we have called a landlord liaison. So someone who could reach out into the community, conduct outreach, and troubleshoot any issues that we may have with the property managers and owners that we currently work with, and then to reach out to others who might be interested in participating in the program. With the change in the economy, sometimes we found ourselves facing people who maybe didn't want to participate in the program. So we think it's a good opportunity for us to reach out and educate individuals, educate those people who may want to rent their units out to the Section 8 program on why this could be a very beneficial program for them, why it's beneficial to the Phoenix community and to low-income residents who actually participate in it. And so our landlord liaison is reaching out into the community and educating individuals on what the roles and responsibilities are of each of the members who participate in the Section 8 program, whether that be us as the administrator of the program, the landlord, or the participant, training them on what are the rules and regulations and the guidelines, and really looking to them to try and find ways that we can improve the process and how we can better interact with them. So we're very excited about that. Those are being conducted in quarterly trainings. We've held 2 thus far. And so as we go on into the spring, we're looking for any feedback that anybody may have about other things that we could train on. This is actually spearheaded out of some conversations that we had with you in your office, Vice Mayor, probably 2 years ago. And so thank you for that. I think it's been, I was in a different capacity at that time, but I think that it's been able to roll us into some really good work. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cindy.
All right, and last, as I mentioned before in the last presentation in June, you had asked us to look into what services we could provide and how could we house victims of domestic violence and human trafficking. And as you heard before in the previous presentation on Starfish Place, the human trafficking victims we determined needed a lot more intensive casework and help and assistance when they were housed in order to get them to a self-sufficiency area. So when we looked at domestic violence and talked to Human Services about the victims of domestic violence, the answer was that the domestic violence victims really need a place to land. They need that more than they need the intensive services. There are about 550 emergency beds for domestic violence victims, so it's very a strong community serving the domestic violence victims. But what we're finding is it's a very short wait to get into the emergency beds, but it's a very long wait to get out because they don't have anywhere to go for housing. So, so what we're proposing in partnership again with Human Services Department is allocating 25 housing choice vouchers to victims of domestic violence as a pilot program. We've never done this before, so we need to figure out how it's going to work. We're going to have to go through a referral process again like we do with the homeless and as we're going to do with the human trafficking victims. So we'll have to set that process up and qualify people for the Section 8 program and make sure that we have a good functioning way of getting them into the program and then helping them find housing. So we want to start with 25 housing choice vouchers for the victims of domestic violence. And then as I mentioned in the Phoenix Starfish Place, we're asking for 15 project-based vouchers to assist to create permanent supportive housing for the victims of human trafficking. So with that, we had a really busy year in Section 8 with the wait list and 27,000 applicants. It was you can tell how many people need housing, and that really opened our eyes as to the need out there. And we're constantly looking for new ways. So we're always accepting new direction. It obviously does very well for us and helps us form partnerships and identify folks who really, really need housing. So we appreciate your guidance and ask for your approval today of the recommendation in front of you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for stepping up to the many things we've challenged you to do. And thank you to our community partners who helped us get through this process and try to do as good and as fair a process as possible with so much demand and need. There definitely continues to be a huge challenge on the housing side, but Phoenix hopefully is start doing our part, and we can always do more, but have some successes to celebrate. Any questions from my colleagues? Would entertain a motion.
I would move for the recommendations for the preference of the 25 HCVs and the 15 project-based vouchers.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Passes unanimously. Wonderful. Well, thank you. Moving on to agenda item 8. Working on business intelligence in partnership with other Arizona communities. And a first for the Shen subcommittee, we will welcome our city manager, Ed
I
Zerker.
made it. I'm so happy. Actually, I'm happy to be here for this because this is doing something that the council's actually been asking us to do, which is find ways to leverage our assets regionally and use them to generate revenue. So Denise and Sandra have done a good job here in bringing people on to a fixed cost for us. We had to pay for this business intelligence anyway. And in partnering up, we're being responding to what the council's asked for. So I'm very proud of what they've done and interested to have them let us all know about it.
So thank you, Vice Mayor, members of the subcommittee. Just a little bit of background information. Also in 2012, along with the local banking program, they also passed House Bill 2111, and that established that ADOR would start collecting all sales tax for cities. We collect about $750 million of sales tax, so this revenue is very important to us. So Sandy Schilling, the Assistant Finance Director, started working with the IT department to come up with some business analytics and business intelligence to make sure that we protected our revenue going forward once the state takes over collections, which will be implemented January 1st of 2017. So it's coming up very quickly. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sandy Schilling, who will give you specifics about the program and also about opportunities to work with other cities in this endeavor.
Perfect. Thanks, Denise. Thank you for your time.
So I want to start today by explaining to you what business intelligence is. So it's actually a tool, it's a computerized tool that's used for data analytics, which you can take large amounts of raw data and ingest it into the system. The business intelligence tool will actually allow you to run analytics, look for trends. Multiple businesses around the world use business analytics and intelligence to run their businesses. So Phoenix is using the business intelligence starting in about 2012. The Public Works Department actually invested in the infrastructure for BI, and they use it for how many tons of garbage that recycle that they're carrying. They track equipment failures. They track vehicle failures. They can actually even look at the billings that they're doing through the customer care and billing system to see if there's any issues that they may be having. With tax simplification, when it occurred, as Denise mentioned, the finance department developed a need. And we actually worked with our IT and our law departments to come up with this solution. So in the finance department, we're going to use the business intelligence system to actually take two different streams of data and make them into a holistic view. So we're taking the existing tax monitor data that we have from our system, and we're taking the Department of Revenue's information in to combine it into one revenue stream for us. In the finance department, this is actually a couple of views from our business intelligence system that we have up right now. The finance department is using this to track the activity that's happening with TPT right now, and also the trending. Right, with our old system, we never had a real way to be able to see in easy format where the money was coming from. So this is good for presentations. It's good for all kinds of analytics. One of the main reasons that we implemented this business intelligence as well is to make sure that we could protect our revenue as far as the information that DOR was giving to us, and ensure that the revenue that we were getting before simplification and after simplification is stable. So when simplification, the concept of simplification came up and started occurring, we realized that Phoenix had a tool. We had this BI that we could use, but not the other cities didn't have this kind of a powerful tool that they could use for any kind of analytics and what was happening. So at that point, we worked with the law department and in our IT, information technology services departments to figure out what we could do and actually share this tool and this huge investment that the city of Phoenix has made with other cities that would never be able to invest in some kind of a tool like this. So we were kind of trying to form a co-op with the other cities. So legally and technology-wise, we determined that we could do this safely. So what we need to do to be able to share this tool with other cities is enter into IGAs that are the business intelligence specific. And we also need to get some reimbursement for our costs. So what we're asking is for jurisdictions, the maximum amount that we would ask for a jurisdiction is about $14,000. And that's a one-time fee to help us recover the cost of our investment. There would also be an ongoing maintenance charge, which would be per jurisdiction a maximum of up to $2,500. If we were to get all other 90 cities to participate with us, that would be a one-time recovery cost of almost $280,000. And on an annual basis, we could recover up to $50,000. So what we did, working with IT, working with law, working with the other cities, we started providing demos as our tool was built, showed the non-program cities. There's 13 other non-program cities to keep it kind of on a small scope to make sure that we knew what we were doing before we advertised and tried to roll this out to all the other 91 cities. So doing those demos and providing that information to the other cities, we have actually come up with 11 other cities that want to participate with us in this. They would represent over $80,000 in the one-time cost recovery and about $14,000 of the annual maintenance cost recovery starting in next July. So what we would like to ask is that the SHIN
would let us go forward to full council and let us enter into these IGAs and also accept these other cities' monies for participation.
Wonderful, thank you. Councilman Waring.
Thank you. So I love the idea about the cost sharing, but this is a new program for us. Is that correct? A new,
The business intelligence
Yeah.
system. The business intelligence system has been up since about 2012.
okay, so it's fairly new. I
Relatively
mean, it's
new.
working fine. I mean, let me ask you this. We bring in these other cities, I'll ask it a different way, and it doesn't work for some reason. Do they sue us or are we, you see what I'm saying? I mean, what if the service that they've already paid for doesn't work? What happens then? I mean, it must be something you guys
Yes.
contemplate,
That has to
I
be,
would think.
that's got to be part of the IGA is
Right.
the understanding about downtime, failures, whatever, would have to be negotiated in the IGA.
Yeah, Councilman Waring, we've been working with the lawyers to make sure that, we've got all of our terms and conditions that meet all the requirements, to make sure we're not responsible for the data. And then if we have technical difficulties, we're going to work with IT to make sure we provide that service to them. And we'll also probably adjust payments if something like that happens.
And the platform that we have is an Oracle platform, so it is very stable. It is known, this is kind of the industry standard for all businesses out there. We have a very competent IT staff that is working on our BI system. And like Ed and Denise said, in our IGA, it is mentioned the hours of service that we will provide, our normal operating business hours. If there's something that happens outside of that, they'll have to call us the next day.
And so this is used to generate letters that effectively say, you owe us money.
No.
It's not,
This is,
okay,
this
all
is
right, I wanna make
actually, this is a system, we're going from, with simplification, we're going from having systems that we have all of the data in to living on data provided to us from the state. So all this is, it's a huge database where we put information in to be able to do those analytics to see who is not paying. But this system will not generate those letters. This system is going to allow us to see who may or may not be paying and then deal with that on the outside of it.
Okay, so then these other cities would be responsible for generating their own letters, using the data that's provided by the state. We're more of a pass-through.
That's exactly right. We are
Because I did have some
totally,
concerns. I mean, I think maybe Denise and I have discussed this, or Ed. I mean, the state's had issues where they're sending out false letters and stuff.
absolutely.
I used to get those calls at the legislature, that.
Yeah, Apache Junction's
it
not
was
going to
pretty
get letters
hardcore
from the city
letters,
of
too.
Phoenix. They're going to,
Correct.
they're just using, because they couldn't afford to invest in a tool of this magnitude as a city like Apache Junction or Douglas. We've already invested in it, so it's easier for them to just pay a little bit in and share our platform than to buy their own, which they would never be able to do.
Right. And built into the IGA is a mechanism for them to get to this data. That's all Phoenix is doing, is displaying their data for them. We have nothing to do with their data, and we have disclaimers everywhere that says, this is DOR data that we're displaying for you.
I was just envisioning us as Phoenix Council getting complaints from that person at Apache
No.
Junction who gets a
Right.
false letter or gets how
Yeah.
are we responsible for this? That made me nervous.
That's
I've
correct.
experienced it a different.
That's a reasonable fear in there,
Okay.
taking care of it. What happens is, so today.
I'm not the technical
No.
person, so
So
best to have
today,
these questions asked.
we care which
Yes.
side of Scottsdale Road a business is on,
Yeah.
right? In your district,
Sure, right.
east is Scottsdale, west is Phoenix. To the state, it's all in Arizona, so they don't necessarily care to the level we do. So this tool allows us to dig into that. This, where is the convenience store chain? Is it in Phoenix or not? The Cox customers who maybe have a non-Phoenix address but are actually in Phoenix, are we making sure that those revenues are coming to Phoenix? That's what this tool allows us to do, because to the state, it's not really relevant data to them. As long as they know they're in Arizona, that's what they care about. We care about which side of Scottsdale Road or 48th Street they're on.
So for citizens, not even in Phoenix necessarily, around the state who partner with us, this is an efficiency savings effectively, much better than Apache Junction trying to buy this, I'm sure,
Absolutely.
onerously expensive system. It's a system that's been going for a couple of years, so we're pretty confident it works. But even if it didn't work one day, as long as we got it back up and running, it's not a disaster.
That's correct.
It doesn't generate tax bills or tax data for Phoenix residents either, it sounds like, but it's just looking at the data that's provided by the state, so it's not creating new data or anything else. It's basically taking their data and breaking it down
In
into more
ways that
usable
cities care about.
So more usable bites that the cities care about that the state does not. Is that a fair summary of?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And then we get paid a little something for the effort.
That's right.
Is that-
Correct.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's much better than what I feared it might be, so that's good.
We are not taking over other people's
Yeah, no, I just-
responsibilities, which is, you're right, we do not want to do that.
What's the computer system in the Terminator movies? I was a little worried that run amok, Cyberdyne, that's right. Oh, good catch.
Wow.
Yeah, all right. Oh, yeah, I didn't know you were a sci-fi person. Right.
All right. Fabulous.
Yep.
Any additional council member questions?
Just a quick question. So in the staff report, you talk about 10, but you show 11?
Yes.
So you've added.
I'm actually working on 12 right now, so.
Oh, so we're up to 12. Okay,
Yes,
that's good.
yes.
Okay, I was getting a little
Can you say what
confused.
the other one is you're looking
The other one is Gilbert. We're working
Okay,
with Gilbert
all
right
right,
now.
thanks. All right.
We've got some detailed analysis
telling
happening in
you,
the city
yeah,
council.
Yes, it is amazing, and as you get in there, the more data that you look at, it takes you down different paths every single time. This will be a huge analytical tool for BNR to use as well for trending into the future.
Excellent. Okay, with that, I would entertain a motion.
I so move.
Second?
Second. Oh, sorry.
All in favor, please say aye.
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 And we did have Councilman Valenzuela on, I think. Yeah, excellent. So it passes 4-0. And with that, I don't think we're going to let Denise leave. We have our grand finale agenda item for 2016, excess property disposal process. So welcome our Deputy City Manager, Paul Blue.
Good afternoon, Vice Mayor and members of the subcommittee. I'm here today with Jamie Spear from the Real Estate Division of the Finance Department, and we have been cruelly abandoned by the CFO, Denise Olson.
Yeah, I was told Denise had to stay up here, but I guess we'll let her off.
No. And we're here today to give you an update on the city's excess property disposal process. Denise, can you hand me the device here? And so a few years ago, the council gave direction to staff to start pursuing the disposal of excess land and buildings. And the finance department took on yeoman's effort because we had a distributed, as you all well know, a distributed process for the holding of our property in 23 different departments, all organized in different ways, different formats. And it was brought together into a singular format to help us understand that we own about 5,500 parcels plus or minus, and really put us in a position to analyze what we had and to try to advance the ball in terms of disposing of that. In 2014, the council authorized hiring Jones Lang LaSalle as the city's real estate broker to market and transact property disposals, and particularly those that are more of a simple straight up sale transaction. And to date, in this time period, city departments have sold or leased about 90 properties, or in contract or marketing and negotiating for another 173, representing about $34 million in revenue. $9 million is through a direct sale, about $11 million relates to leases, and about $14 million are in the pending negotiating status. And so let's talk about quick examples of property that we've picked up. So when we built light rail, or when we build streets, we end up having to make sometimes large acquisitions of properties to fairly compensate the property owners who abutted the development of that project. And so this is at about just past 16th Street in Washington, is a piece of land currently being listed that was picked up as a part of the light rail development. This is a Head Start building just south of Lincoln on 7th Avenue. Again, is a property that is not necessary for the current delivery of city services, and so the Human Services Department put this forward to dispose of. And then property where we just didn't need the real estate anymore because we bought it for a purpose that was never executed. And so there was some property at about 22nd Avenue and Greenway where we were going to have a police operation, and we have subsequently sold the property. And so excess property, as you can see, falls into a couple of different categories. But all told, there's about up to about 300 parcels that departments have asked for or have suggested are available for review as excess property. And they fall into these categories I described of land that's not needed for current or anticipated near-term future city services, land that may be potentially dedicated as right-of-way and needs to be evaluated, and land being held in an unused condition to serve future city services. And then I would add a fourth, as we've been evaluating, we've identified property that appeared to be vacant, actually had a need. We needed to do something with it. Oftentimes, the hidden thing that's not always seen and sometimes gets lost is the fact that we have a lot of property for drainage that supports particularly our streets facilities. It's not always immediately apparent. And as we've collected up all the things that we've owned, we've had to go through the process to understand and identify what those situations were. Earlier in the year, the city manager has asked staff to pursue how we can more quickly move property into a keep it for purposes of use of city services or move it to disposal, and do that all on a much more timely basis. And so a team has been pulled together led by the city manager's office that includes the finance department, the planning department, budget and research, and community and economic development, empowered by the manager to break down silos and simply get after the questions much more expeditiously related to saying we need to keep the property, we need to go get some more information and quickly get that to make a decision, or we should dispose of it. And so we're, as referenced in the report, we're meeting every other week. We met last week, we're meeting this week, and we're here today to talk to you ultimately for your recommendation to the full council, actions related to street transportation, excess property that we have evaluated. And so we, as per kind of our committed goal as we started the disposal process, is we visit with the council offices who are affected by purchases that are consequential in some way. Because of development that may be in or near neighborhoods, and there are questions. So we're talking to the council offices when those situations arise. We're going to come back to this subcommittee to talk about the disposition of all of these properties, whether we sell or not. We want to come forward and tell you what those decisions are and why. And then we'll ultimately go forward to the full council to take action on all of these properties. Again, the goal over the next handful of months, we really want to move through these 300 parcels, plus or minus, and move those into an action, whether to retain or whether to sell or lease. In the case of the streets department, of the 70 properties that were identified, 7 have already been authorized by the council to go out and be marketed, or they're imminently in the process of being marketed. 4 are being dedicated as right-of-way. 3 are pending authorization by the council that we're asking for today. 12 that we're asking for today relate to properties, and you'll see an example of this where in the development of someone's facility, they encompassed old right-of-way, and we didn't notice 30 years ago, and so now there's 25 square feet that the city owns in the middle of their parking lot. It was just work that needs to get cleaned up to clear the books of that. And then about 44 parcels really relate to this relate to retention for a variety of reasons, either future right-of-way, sidewalks, landscaping, drainage. And so just a few examples for you. So this is at 26th Street in Jefferson, and it's where the Washington and Jefferson come back together. This is a parcel. It clearly is being used for a street and as part of the development of light rail. This was a separate parcel that was part of the acquisition where we bought a slight piece of property. It was never dedicated as right-of-way, and so we have a lot of cleanup in that area to do. And in this situation, this is south of Campbell against the 51, and I believe Jamie, the adjoining property owner, is interested in this property, if I remembered that one correctly. And so we want to get the council's authorization to put this out and available for sale. In this one and in one of the other properties I'm going to discuss against the 51, in both cases we would put deed restrictions that relate to billboards, which is to say we're quite fine developing what the zoning allows, but kind of now and forever, let's not bring billboards into these are generally well developed stable neighborhoods. We don't want to introduce new incompatible uses, and so we would try to ensure that doesn't happen for the future. This site also against the 51 is south of Bethany Home. And, you know, with a little bit of adjustment of some of the property we own that's not in the parcel to make it accessible, because it's currently not accessible from the street, it could become a developable parcel for someone who might want to build a home or really if for a residential use. Again, would be deed restricted against the billboard. This is an excess property. I think for the life of us, we don't precisely know why we own it. I imagine it's been decades. And it's about 9,000 square feet, and we think it probably would be helpful to the assemblage of the property for the vacant property that surrounds it. This is an example, and that's actually approximately where we own, my guess is about 10 square feet. It's all private property that surrounds it behind the sidewalk. Again, it's a lack of cleanup of doing plats and similar kinds of documents that are required. And so that's this is an example that's produced over and over on these 12 quitclaim items where we have either small or very thin, long parcels that don't have a great deal of utility to anybody but the adjoining property owner. They've been determined to have a value that is de minimis or zero, pose a maintenance problem. We recommend quitclaim deed back to the property owner who immediately surrounds or is adjacent to the property. This is another example where I believe we owned an alley or a drainage way sitting in someone's parking lot underneath their shades. We gave building permits to build here, and clearly this was from a platting of property that occurred a long time ago, and probably was not cleaned up. Either we didn't catch it in the development process, in replatting, and so the old pattern of development that existed is clearly superseded, and it would be appropriate to quitclaim deed this back to the property owner. This is another example of property where it was, well, this is excess property, we could dispose of it next to the freeway, but in point of fact, it actually is a necessary drainage way for the neighborhood because of the freeway facility. This is a sidewalk that's on West Cholla, and it is a meandering sidewalk with landscaping. Again, we just kept it as a parcel. It should have been dedicated, and so we're working through trying to clean up all of these things to create clarity for what is the city's owned assets that really have true value. And so this is a part of the cleanup effort. Again, every 2 weeks we're meeting to kind of push these away. So our recommendation to you today is to convey, as listed in the attachment of the report, 12 parcels by quitclaim deed, market the 3 parcels that are listed for disposal through Jones Lang LaSalle. And with that, we'd be pleased to answer any questions you might have.
Councilwoman Stark and then Councilman Waring.
Just very quick, so these quick claims, there's no issues with the gift clause, right? It's just because they originally probably did dedicate it to us that we're giving it back?
I think I'll answer first and then I'll let Jamie talk.
Because it's insignificant, maybe?
Yeah, I think this is getting down to because the property actually has next to zero value, there is no one else who can use it. And because they are not developable parcels. And in many cases, they are either very narrow, long bowling alleys that if we don't, we will just simply own these, we believe, time immemorial, and they'll become maintenance obligations to us. And so that's what we believe in visiting with the attorneys, what is the appropriate right thing to do. I don't know if you have anything to add, Jamie?
Yeah, we also have liability in owning these parcels, so we want to relieve ourselves of that liability, which we believe far outweighs the value of any property that we have recommended for quitclaim.
Okay. Because, one of them was over 11,000 square feet. Most of them look like they're 50 or 19 square feet, but the very last one that you're recommending for quitclaim is 11,509 square feet. That's
believe it's
50 West Cypress. I'm sorry, not to have you search, but is it because it's?
No, and it's only, the whole property is that large, but we are dedicating a portion of it. It's actually mostly roadway.
Okay.
And then I think it's about 2,000 square feet that's within somebody's property.
Okay, gotcha. I was trying to understand that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So on pages 33 and 34 of our packet, it kind of takes, I think, a broader view. Is that
Yes,
fair?
sir.
And so there was an article in the paper a couple of weeks ago. I thought it was a pretty accurate summary of where I think we're at, not just my own comments, but I think other members of this council were in there as well, along with Bill Gates, who used to be a member and deserves the kudos he got there for trying to get us more on the ball about what we own and what to do with it. But there's, I think, maybe 3 points on page 34 that, first of all, it sounds like, unlike the past, you're meeting about it every couple weeks, which is different. So it's, I assume by definition, more than you were meeting before about this subject, and that'll spur activity. Number 2 is there's going to be a page on the city's website, because I know that's a source of frustration for people I've talked to who are like, I have to go track down what you guys even own. The paper said, there's no list.
Thank you, Councilman, and I apologize. I went too quickly. We will be developing a page on the city's website of all currently council-authorized properties that are available for marketing. One of the
People
things,
don't know where to look.
Right, right.
I mean,
And
how
so-
do you even know there's something you want to buy? Where do you go find it?
Yeah, and so we'll have it so that it is sortable. So if you want to look at either by address, by size, we're going to try and have it by a couple of different categories. And my goal is kind of in the January, February timeframe. I want it up because it's not, I don't want to be too glib, but it's not that complicated. And so we think we should be able to get it. I think the one other thing that I wanted to additionally mention, 2 points, and this is right in the vein of what you're talking about, Councilman, is in addition to this 300-ish, I want to be really clear, there's another 780 some parcels that the airport has that have been going through about an 18-month process that when it concludes yet this fiscal year, all in the Vice Mayor's district, subject to, it's an FAA requirement to do this analysis that we're doing, and it involves a very large amount of community conversation, the end of which will be the airport will be laser focused on trying to monetize that property, some of it in sale, some of it in lease, and some of it may be a while because we'll come to you at a subsequent meeting to share this with you, but it is, as the Vice Mayor is well aware, this is a checkerboard that is very, very, and we did good things helping community members make different choices to move away from noise impacted areas, but it's not all easy to try and sell this property, and probably not all timely, but I didn't want to fail to tell you that. And then second, once we've concluded this 300, we're actually, we're going to go back through the remaining 5,200 or so parcels, because I'm a believer if we're in this every 2 weeks, let's just go cycle through it all and make sure we have not sifted through appropriately all the parcels. And then we will be instituting a policy where we execute this, not kind of the next time someone asks us, but actually periodically we're going to expose our list and inventory of property to what's available, affirmatively to the departments. Please tell us what you think you can dispose of on an annual basis. And I suspect in some other episodic, every other year or some other frequency, actually go back through the whole entire list again to make sure we have appropriately addressed the property, discuss those that we continue to retain to ensure vacant property we retain for a future purpose still needs to, and is meeting that purpose and is still timely for us to keep it, and then other decisions as may arise in that evaluation.
All of it sounds better than the current situation.
And we do, I think, have some real successes on working with the vacant properties, so.
Well, things are way better than they were a few years ago, that's for sure.
At least in
But-
my case, I feel like I've spent an enormous amount of
Yes.
my time this year on vacant property. So all morning today on airport land reuse, and Paul and I sat through many meetings planning the bioscience campus and making sure that while it is important to activate that vacant property, that we do it in a way that positions the city and our economy for continued future growth. Neighborhood services, we've spent a lot of time on the Broadway Road corridor where the city owns property, making sure we get it right. So there was community conversations, and now we're moving forward with addressing affordable housing, which we heard over and over again at today's council meeting. We have a long way to go, and we're making sure that as we do develop the city's property, that we're aware of the market, that we've done the studies, and we're doing it in a responsible way. So I think we must have 15 different departments working on this right now. It is fabulous that we have come together and have the folks at the table leading the effort to coordinate, but that is not the only effort. And there are some easy decisions where we own 10 feet in the middle of someone else's property, but there's also some where if we're going to be responsible, we have to talk to the community, and we have to think long-term about the fact that these are assets that needed to be activated and that people live next door to some of them in some cases, so that we ought to let them know what we are doing and get feedback.
I think, Vice Mayor, that's a really great point, because the Streets Department, I don't want to be too glib, but these weren't really super hard decisions. They just needed to be made and pushed the ball forward and clean up some stuff. There are going to be some things that are going to be very, I think we'll have, the community will have 3 opinions about it. And some will involve to execute their opinion might involve capital we don't have today. And so deciding to keep the property in the face of those situations are going to be hard choices that we need to evaluate. We're going to be weighing sustainability issues we have against development, particularly as it relates to parks land. So there is, I think we're going to work our way as fast as we can through the easy things so we can get to what are the actual real hard policy choices to make. The airport is going to have some of that, to be sure, because there aren't going to be easy answers to all of that. In fact, there won't be many easy answers to that property. They will be, many of them will be difficult. But what we commit to the council is that we're going to expeditiously move to these, and when we need to take a body of them, whether it's parks properties or other, and come to a couple of subcommittees, we will do that so that the council has full exposure, can give us direction about how we should be pursuing, evaluating, and considering those properties. So you should expect that this will be a full-throated process for some time, I imagine. So.
We are not yet perfect neighbors, but we are much more active and engaged neighbors since Ed Zerker became city manager, and we will continue to be. So thanks to folks for their work on this. Although we are just getting started, we are paying attention at the most senior levels.
And I would tell you, I think the finance department deserves a big, huge amount of kudos, because they took what was a challenged body of data and have really advanced the ball so that we're in a position to make decisions.
And we have a card from Greta Rogers, March Neutral. Traditionally, I'm told we do the microphone.
I have a little difficulty standing for any period of time. I clocked my leg about 2.5 months ago really well. Thank you. Thank you for bringing this long dead subject to life. I broached this in 2008 when David was still with us. And I was told, it's too complicated, Greta, we just can't. And you know how well that sat with Greta Rogers. Thank you, and I'll work with you. I was 29 years in the business, and not with my head in a bag. And thank you to Dustin for putting this front and center. These properties are dead assets. They earn not 1 cent. You sell them, they're property taxed. I don't care if the buyer never puts a thing on them. There's property tax, which benefits us. If you deed it, pay the recording fee to A and to B. Pay the recording fee. I don't know what a recording fee is today, but it can't knock your socks off. When I last practiced, it was $30. It's probably up to 60 or so now. But that's, in the City of Phoenix budget, that's like dropping a penny in the red bucket while the gentleman or the lady is ringing a bell right now. And it will produce property tax. This needs a plan, Paul. It needs a plan with execution guidelines to be completed. And a plan for final completion. I don't care if it takes 5 years, and it probably will at least for 5,800 properties. But let's develop the plan and effect it, execute it, and complete it for the benefit of the whole city. Thank you. I also put in a card on 4, but it didn't get to you in time.
Any final council member questions or comments? With that, I would entertain a motion to dispose of 15 parcels from the Street Transportation Department.
So moved.
Second, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Passes. So we have, so that was Councilman Valenzuela. That was.
I'm here. I'm here too. Jim.
Passes 4-0. We're trying to make it as easy as possible to do the minutes today. So that is our final agenda item of 2016. It turns out we do not have any, as far as I know, urgent items for January, so it is possible we could cancel the January Shen unless anyone has anything that needs to move forward in January. All right, so with that, we'll see everyone in February.